On the morning of May 24, 1969, a six-man patrol from 3 Squadron, Australian Special Air Service Regiment, was moving through the jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province when they heard voices. They stopped. They counted. There were approximately 30 North Vietnamese Army soldiers moving along the same track, headed directly toward them. The Australians had 6 men, the NVA had 30. The patrol commander, Sergeant Barry Doyle, made the decision that defined the particular operational philosophy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. He did not call for extraction. He did not request air support. He set up an ambush. The 30 NVA soldiers walked into it. The patrol killed 11 of them, wounded an unknown number more, and disappeared back into the jungle before any organized response could be mounted. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. The patrol was back at its harbor position before the NVA could determine how many men they had just been hit by. The answer, which the survivors eventually figured out, was 6. 6 men had ambushed 30. This was not unusual for the Australian SAS in Vietnam. It was Tuesday. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment was established in 1957, modeled directly on the British SAS that had been founded by David Stirling in the Western Desert in 1941. The Australian version inherited the British regiment's operational philosophy wholesale: small teams, deep penetration, extended periods behind enemy lines without support, emphasis on stealth, patience, and the precise application of violence at a time and place of the patrol's choosing rather than the enemy's. The regiment had been blooded in the Malayan emergency and in Borneo before Vietnam, and it arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 with a body of institutional knowledge about jungle warfare that the American military, for all its technological superiority, had not yet fully developed. Phuoc Tuy Province was the Australian Task Force's area of operations. The province sat southeast of Saigon, between the coast and the jungle highlands, and it contained a significant and experienced Viet Cong and NVA presence that had been operating there for years before the Australians arrived. The Australians approached the province differently from the American approach that prevailed elsewhere in South Vietnam. Where American doctrine emphasized large unit sweeps, firepower, and the destruction of enemy formations through direct engagement, the Australians emphasized intelligence, population security, and the patient denial of the province to enemy forces through persistent small unit presence. The SAS was the sharpest expression of this philosophy. The standard SAS patrol in Vietnam consisted of 4 to 6 men. They inserted by helicopter into areas of known or suspected enemy activity, moving at distances from the landing zone that were designed to prevent the enemy from tracking the insertion. They moved through the jungle at a pace that American infantry would have found almost impossibly slow, sometimes covering less than a kilometer in a full day's movement. They stopped frequently to listen. They communicated by hand signal. They never cooked food because the smell of cooking carried. They slept in positions that could be abandoned silently in 30 seconds. They called artillery or airstrikes on enemy positions they found and disappeared before the smoke cleared. They were in the province for weeks at a time, invisible to an enemy that knew they were there, but frequently could not find them. Sergeant Bob Mox ran a patrol in 1968 that lay motionless for 3 days 40 meters from an NVA company headquarters, observing and recording enemy movement before calling in a fire mission that destroyed the headquarters and killed the senior officer present. 3 days, 40 meters. The NVA conducted patrols during those 3 days that passed within 20 meters of Mox and his 4 men. The Australians did not move. They breathed through their mouths to reduce noise. They urinated where they lay. When the fire mission was complete and they extracted, the NVA searched the area for days trying to determine how they had been found. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. The Australians were already back at Nui Dat, debriefing. The psychological effect of the Australian SAS presence on the enemy was documented in captured NVA and Viet Cong documents and in post-war interviews with former enemy commanders. The documents describe the Australians, whom they called the phantoms of the jungle in some accounts, as an enemy that could not be found and could not be predicted. Several documents specifically reference the SAS as the reason for operational changes that moved NVA units to different areas. One captured order, dated 1969, explicitly told NVA units in Phuoc Tuy to avoid the specific jungle areas where the SAS was known to operate, because engaging them produced casualties disproportionate to any tactical gain. The Australian SAS had achieved something rare in counterinsurgency warfare. They had made their presence a deterrent rather than a target. Corporal Ray Simpson had arrived in Vietnam in 1964 as one of the first Australian advisors and had stayed, rotating through multiple tours with a dedication to the specific landscape and conflict that was unusual even among Special Forces soldiers. Simpson operated in areas that other units avoided, maintained relationships with Montagnard and local intelligence sources that produced targeting information of remarkable quality, and accumulated a combat record across multiple tours that resulted in the award of 2 military medals and eventually the Medal for Gallantry. His official citation described actions that included single-handedly engaging a group of enemy soldiers to cover the extraction of a wounded patrol member, an action he subsequently described in an interview as not particularly remarkable given the circumstances. This kind of understatement was characteristic. The SAS culture that had produced Simpson did not encourage the elaboration of individual achievement. You did what was necessary and you came back and you prepared to go out again. The Long Tan connection provides essential context for understanding what the Australian SAS made possible. The Battle of Long Tan on August 18, 1966, in which Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, fought a force of approximately 2,500 NVA and Viet Cong soldiers to a standstill with 108 men, is one of the most remarkable small unit actions of the Vietnam War. What is less often noted is that the intelligence which placed Delta Company in the position to intercept the enemy movement came largely from SAS patrol reports that had been tracking NVA movement in the Long Tan rubber plantation area for days before the battle. The SAS had seen them coming. The tactical response to that intelligence was what produced Long Tan. The intelligence itself was the SAS's contribution, invisible in the historical record of the battle but essential to its outcome. The tracking skills that the Australian SAS developed in Vietnam drew on a specific capability that the regiment had cultivated since its Malayan emergency experience. The Australians had trained with and learned from Aboriginal trackers, EBAN trackers from Borneo, and the indigenous knowledge systems that these communities had developed over generations. In Vietnam, this translated into a capacity to read jungle terrain and movement signs that frequently exceeded what American units could do. A bent stem, a disturbed leaf, a footprint pressed differently into mud than the surrounding ground. These were readable texts to trained SAS trackers, and the information they contained was tactically valuable in ways that technology could not then replicate. The rules of engagement under which the Australian SAS operated differed from American practice in ways that were not always acknowledged in official channels. The SAS was authorized to conduct what were described as reconnaissance patrols, which in practice often involved offensive actions against enemy forces the patrol encountered. The distinction between reconnaissance and direct action was maintained in the paperwork and was frequently not maintained in the jungle. The Australians were not there to observe and report only. They were there to find the enemy, and when circumstances permitted, to engage them on terms favorable to the patrol. The 6-against-30 ambush that opened this story was not a defensive reaction. It was a deliberate choice to engage at a moment when the patrol commander judged that the tactical situation favored the attack. The casualty exchange ratio achieved by the Australian SAS in Vietnam was extraordinary by any metric. Over the course of the regiment's Vietnam deployment from 1966 to 1971, SAS patrols conducted more than 1,200 operational missions. They killed an estimated 500 enemy soldiers in direct engagements and called in fire missions that inflicted significantly larger numbers of casualties. Against this, the regiment suffered 2 men killed in action in direct combat during the entire deployment. 2. The number requires repetition because it is almost statistically incomprehensible in the context of a sustained combat deployment in a war that killed 60,000 Americans. 2 men killed in direct combat across 5 years and 1,200 missions. The operational security, the field craft, the judgment about when to engage and when to disappear that kept those numbers where they were, constituted a body of practical knowledge that the regiment had developed over years and that no amount of equipment or firepower could substitute for. The relationship between the Australian SAS and their American counterparts was professional, occasionally tense, and marked by a mutual respect that expressed itself more in operational cooperation than in expressions of admiration. American Special Forces, particularly the Green Berets who operated in similar terrain under similar doctrinal principles, understood what the Australians were doing and valued the intelligence their patrols produced. American conventional infantry commanders, who operated under different doctrinal assumptions and different political pressures, were sometimes frustrated by an Allied unit that declined to engage in the large unit operations that American doctrine emphasized. The Australians were polite about this. They also continued operating exactly as they had been operating because their methods were producing results that justified the approach regardless of doctrinal preference. Staff Sergeant Kevin Conway was one of the few Australian SAS soldiers killed in Vietnam, dying on patrol in May 1971 in the final year of the Australian deployment. His death came under circumstances that were, by the standards of what the regiment had survived over 5 years, almost ironic in their ordinariness. A patrol contact, a burst of enemy fire, one of the most experienced special operations soldiers in the Australian Army, a man who had navigated hundreds of kilometers of enemy-held jungle, killed in a contact that lasted seconds. The war's arithmetic did not respect the accumulation of skill or experience. It was always the next second that mattered, and the next second had no memory of the ones that had come before. The Australian SAS left Phuoc Tuy Province in 1971. The enemy's assessment of the departure was documented in a captured communication that described the withdrawal of the Phantoms as the opening of the jungle. It was not a triumphant document. It was a tactical assessment. The jungle was open again. The implication was understood. What had been closed, the freedom of movement, the security in the deep bush, the ability to move without the knowledge that something invisible was watching, was now restored. It had taken 5 years of continuous SAS presence to close it. It opened again immediately. The province fell to the North Vietnamese in 1975 with the rest of South Vietnam. The gains the Australians had made in Phuoc Tuy, the province security they had built through years of patient small unit work, the intelligence networks they had cultivated, the particular form of control that comes not from occupation, but from the enemy's knowledge that you are present and capable, all of this dissolved in the broader collapse. The regiment that had achieved a kill ratio of approximately 250 to 1 had not won the war, because wars are not won by patrol kill ratios. They are won or lost for reasons that operate at levels above the 6-man patrol moving through the jungle at 300 meters per hour, reading the bent stems, counting the footprints, choosing the moment to strike and the moment to disappear. The Australian SAS veterans of Vietnam are elderly men now, most in their 70s and 80s. They have a reunion association. They produce a newsletter. They gather periodically and sit with other men who were there and understand without explanation what was required of them and what they gave. They do not generally seek public attention. The operational culture that shaped them in the jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province shaped them permanently. They did what was necessary. They came back. They prepared to go out again. Most of them are still preparing, in the particular way of soldiers who never fully decommission, even when the jungle is 40 years behind them, and the enemy they tracked with such lethal patience is long since gone. There is a video on screen right now about the other Allied forces that fought alongside Americans in Vietnam and what their contributions cost them. Subscribe. The untold stories of this war are not all American. Some of the best ones are from men who came from the other side of the world and fought in the dark, with 6 men against 30 and won.